Welcome to the Antioch University Santa Barbara Writing Center Understanding APA workshop. This part of the workshop is APA Style Part 2, Reducing Bias. This is part of a 5-video series on APA style and format. This is part 2 on APA style out of 3 parts on APA style, and then there are 2 parts on APA format. So a brief overview of what we're going to talk about in this video. Basically, it's all about ways to reduce bias in language, most of them from APA 7th edition manual. And any page numbers you'll see in the slides are page numbers from the APA 7th edition manual. In particular, some of the strategies I'm going to talk about are about how to be appropriately specific to help reduce bias. And I'll also talk about singular they, which APA has endorsed. So, to reduce bias in language, it's always been part of APA style that you should mention only relevant characteristics about the people you're writing about. So for any of these kind of different types of identities that people can have, you should only mention them when relevant. In the APA 7th edition, they added that this important note that you should, though, remember to acknowledge relevant differences that do exist. Also, it's important to be sensitive to labels when talking about people and their identities. So you should respect the language people use to describe themselves. You can think of it like calling people what they call themselves, but it's even more accurate to say call people what they want to be called, because sometimes people have kind of in-group ways of referring to themselves and people who share their identity that they wouldn't want those terms to be used by people outside of that shared identity group to refer to them. So it's really call people what they want to be called. And sometimes that takes a little research, and really the most important thing is being considerate and sensitive to labels. So there's a few terms like handicapped and elderly that are no longer preferred in writing in the APA style. So for example, instead of handicap, you would use the phrase people with a physical disability. Instead of the word elderly, you could use the word older, or it's even better if you can get more specific. For example, people 65 years and older, or whatever specific age range you're talking about. The only thing about these words that are no longer preferred anymore is that you'll never be able to find a complete list of all the words that we're no longer using and all the words that are better to use, because language is always changing. It's always evolving. Even APA 7th edition manual, which came out in 2019, is probably outdated already in some ways, and will definitely be outdated by the time the 8th edition comes out in terms of some of these labels, because language is always changing and evolving, and some of these things are shifting. So I just recommend being sensitive to that and aware of that, and do a little research when you can on what's the most updated best term to use to describe someone's identity in your writing. As I mentioned, it can really help to be more specific in reducing bias. You want to be appropriately specific. So for example, if you're describing the findings of an article that talked about people with Alzheimer's disease, you would want to use that same phrasing in your writing rather than the broader term people with types of dementia. You want to keep that specific term. Similarly, if you're describing the results of a study where they talked about participants who were 13 to 18 years old, keep that specific wording rather than making it more general and just saying under 18 years old. And when you're writing about a racial or ethnic identity group, be as specific as possible. If a study was referring only to Chinese Americans rather than all Asian Americans, then it's better to be that specific if you can. So here's an example of some non-specific and non-ideal wording, and we can practice revising it. So participants included poor elderly non-whites. The words poor and elderly are just not preferred anymore. The word non-white, there's nothing wrong with that specifically, except it's really not specific enough in this case. If we're assuming that we're kind of summarizing a psychological study that talked about a specific group of non-whites, then we would want to name that specific racial or ethnic group. So this is a good moment if you'd like to pause the video and think about a possible revision, and there's not just one right answer for this. So take your time, and I'll go ahead and show you my possible revision. Like I said, there's not just one right answer to this. It could be anything depending on which article you're writing about. But basically this is longer, but it's more specific. So here the specific group of non-whites that article happened to be talking about could have been Mexican Americans. Instead of the word elderly, we have a specific age range over the age of 65. And instead of the word poor, we use this longer phrase, who had incomes below the federal poverty level. You can also even Google, the federal poverty level in the United States. It changes from year to year, and you can Google the federal poverty level in a specific year and for a family of 3 or a family of 4. So you could say who had incomes below the federal poverty level for a family of 3, and that would be even more specific. Here's one more practice we can do. Researchers collected data from mentally ill urban youth. So again, here mentally ill is just a term that's not really specific enough, assuming that the study we're talking about was focused on a specific mental illness. And the words urban and youth are just not preferred. For one thing, they're not that specific. For another thing, urban and youth, both of those terms, separately and especially together, have historically been used in kind of coded anti-Black racist ways to describe young Black Americans. So it's really unclear here actually whether the writer is referring to young Black people or simply people who live in cities and urban areas or some combination of that. So again, I recommend if you'd like to pause the video, take a moment and try to come up with a possible revision for this. And there's not just one right answer. There's a lot of different possibilities. So take your time and I will show you my revision. Again, there's not just one right answer, but this is a lot more specific where instead of youth, we have from adolescents age 13 to 18. So we have a really specific age range now that's a lot less vague than the word youth, which maybe could extend into people's 20s or something. Here we see that the author actually meant people who lived in metropolitan areas when they were using urban, and a specific mental illness met criteria for schizophrenia or depression. So some other recommendations from the APA manual to avoid or reduce bias in language are to avoid false hierarchies when you can. And this is just something to pay attention to. A false hierarchy is when you use one group, often it's our own, as the standard against which others are judged. So the example they give in the APA manual is contrasting lesbians with the general public or normal women, thus implying that lesbians are not members of the general public or not quote unquote normal. And so you want to be careful of noticing when you're accidentally creating that kind of false hierarchy. I think another example of this is when people use the word foreign as in he was speaking a foreign language. Well, that's a relative term. So do you really maybe just mean he was speaking a non-English language because maybe that language is not foreign to him, or maybe you are in a foreign country right now, or maybe you are in the US, but lots of languages are spoken in the US and English is not the official language of the US. That doesn't have an official language. So it's kind of setting up a hierarchy of anything that's not English is foreign when that's relative. It depends on who you are, what languages you grew up speaking. So just think about that and be as specific as possible. Another part of APA style is to capitalize all racial and ethnic terms. So when you're writing an APA style, you should be capitalizing all of these terms that describe racial and ethnic identities. That includes in APA the word Black, the word white, as well as any other term like Native American, Indigenous, Latin American, or Latinx or Latina. These are terms that are gender neutral and are not assuming a gender binary. And then in APA, it says to be conscious about your use of words like minorities and underprivileged. So sometimes people might use these words kind of unthinkingly to mean people of color or underrepresented groups, but it's not necessarily accurate that those people are always underprivileged or minorities. Like, be specific and only use the term minority for what it literally means. So, a subgroup with characteristics different from the majority of a population. For example, it's fine to say Muslim minorities living in India. But if you mean people of color here in the US, you have to think about, for example, certain counties in Southern California, Latinx or Latina people should not be described as a minority because they may actually be in the majority with fewer white people in certain counties. So, it's better to avoid that word if you're not using it in a way where you're sure of the numbers. And instead, be specific if you do mean people of color or underrepresented groups instead of people who are necessarily minorities or underprivileged. Last point I'm going to share with you today is that APA has endorsed singular they with their 7th edition. And singular they is not a new term or grammatical feature at all. It's actually been in use in English since the 14th century. So I'm sure English speakers will recognize that these sound really normal. Each patient should be told in advance how much they will be required to pay. But a journalist should not be forced to reveal their sources. So in both of these examples, we're using they or their to describe just one singular person instead of plural people. But we're using those terms because we don't know the gender of the patient and the journalist, and they're just kind of a generic or hypothetical person, so the gender is not relevant there. Singular they is more recently also used with known individuals who do not identify as male or female or just who use singular they as their pronouns. So for example, this is my friend Jay. I met them at work. They are a talented artist. APA recommendations are to use, all of these types of singular they to avoid assumptions about gender. So use singular they, avoid clunky expressions like he or she or he/she or s/he. Those are all assuming a gender binary. And, use singular they when the gender of a generic or hypothetical person is irrelevant, which is going to be almost all the time. And when referring to individuals whose pronouns are not known. Also, APA says we should use people's self-identified pronouns. They give examples including he, she, they, and a lot of other examples on page 140 of the manual. And because language is always changing as well, they're not going to have a complete list of all the pronouns that are people's self-identified pronouns, but we should respect people's pronouns, whatever they are. Also, all of the principles for reducing bias, the entire chapter 5 of APA 7th edition style is on their website, not behind a paywall, free for you to read. And you can read on these different topics. Today, I didn't even talk about writing about age or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status very much, but, or disability. I really kind of only talked a bit about how APA's recommendations for racial and ethnic identity. So take a look at their website if you're interested, and you can find, the full text of APA recommendations for these things for free online. It's also linked from the Santa Barbara Writing Center website. Thank you for watching. This was APA Style Part 2, Reducing Bias, and check out our other videos on APA Style and APA format.